When it came to writing the villains in the original trilogy, George Lucas and the other fellow writers went with a fairly simple choice. The small rebellion would be fighting against the Galactic Empire, which controlled nearly every system that they came into contact with. This was a fairly simple move, the underdog good guys fighting up against the big guy bad guys. However, whenever writing the prequel trilogy starting in 1999, George Lucas went with an entirely different route. And it is my humble opinion that George Lucas struck gold whenever writing the prequel trilogy, especially when it came to writing the villains. Now, we can argue all we want about whether or not the prequels are good or bad, however, I think we can all agree that the villains and the stories that they tell are actually genius. Starting off, it was very clear that the dynamic between the good guys and the bad guys was flipped from the original trilogy. Where in the original trilogy, the good guys were the small underdogs, it is actually the Sith Lords who are vying for power throughout the prequel trilogy, whereas the Jedi and the good guys have the actual power in the universe with the Galactic Republic. When writing the prequel trilogy, it was very clear that George Lucas wanted to have Palpatine's rise to power be somewhat subtle in many ways. We, the audience, knew that he was rising to become the Emperor, however the characters in the movies did not. This is only further exemplified with the conflict of the Clone Wars. When analyzing the conflict that was the Clone Wars, it's very important to realize that George Lucas designed it to be a very fixed outcome. The Separatists and the systems that joined it were pawns. They were truly never evil people. And I recognize that many people will say that the Separatist Alliance was under the control of the Sith Lord Count Dooku, but so was the Republic under the control of the Sith Lord Darth Sidious. The entirety of the Clone Wars was a fixed war. Darth Sidious and Dooku had carefully plotted the outcome of every single battle, with minor upsets only coming in the form of Mother Talzin, Darth Maul, and Hondo Ohnaka, which we see detailed throughout Star Wars The Clone Wars as well as the Son of Dathomir comic. It's important to note that George Lucas's writing was further exemplified with the contextualization provided by the Star Wars The Clone Wars TV show. Without it, much of the information that we have nowadays would simply never be known. Of course, the fixed outcomes of each individual battle by the hands of Dooku and Sidious served to weaken both the Separatist Alliance and the Galactic Republic enough to where the Empire could sweep in and take over both. And it wasn't a mistake by George Lucas to have the Jedi serve as generals during the war, nor was it a mistake to have the Republic, the seemingly good guys, have the slave army, whereas the Separatists had a very easily disposable, affordable, and replaceable droid army. As seen in Star Wars The Clone Wars, the Republic developed a very strong anti-clone sentiment, as they were very expensive and took 10 years to create one capable soldier, whereas the Separatist Alliance was able to make one battle droid in a matter of mere moments. By George Lucas having the Jedi be in officer positions in the Grand Army of the Republic, it actually puts them in a place where they are not meant to be. If anything, the Jedi should have been peacekeepers and opposed the Clone Wars in its entirety, attempting to negotiate a peace between the Separatists and the Republic. Instead, they were the army's leaders. Thus, the noble image of the Jedi was unfortunately tainted throughout the Clone Wars, making them seem as though they were warmongers rather than peacekeepers. This is exemplified further in the Mandalorian episodes, which featured Duchess Satine talking with Obi-Wan about when she remembers that the Jedi were once peacekeepers. And of course, this brings us to Order 66, and just another example of how George Lucas, whether we like to admit it or not, was a good writer when it came to the prequel trilogy in some respects. When the order to execute the Jedi came, most clones didn't hesitate. This is due to the inhibitor chip. However, this didn't change or affect the opinions of the public people of the Galactic Republic, now the Galactic Empire. After a 3-year-long war, it really wouldn't have been that far of a jump to move the Jedi from noble peacekeepers to complete and utter warmongers. And moving away from George Lucas, this is actually what we see in the 2017 Darth Vader comic, when Jedi lightsabers are being burned in the streets of Coruscant by Senate officials. And thus this brings us full circle. While the original trilogy had the underdog good guys, the underdogs in the prequel trilogy were the Sith Lords, the villains, the bad guys, and the antagonists. The Separatist Alliance was never the bad guys of the movie, just the same as the Republic was never the bad guys. It was the two Sith Lords that leaded both forms of government, not the actual government itself. And yet, they took military positions when war broke out. This, coupled with the fact that the Republic used a slave army as opposed to easily disposable droids, made for strong anti-war sentiment, and whenever the realization, the of course fake propaganda, that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic and attempted to kill the Chancellor, this news came to not much shock. And when the Empire took hold and the last vestiges of the Jedi Order were swept away, no one remembered them for the noble peacekeepers that they were. And while many people like to criticize George Lucas for bad dialogue and bad directing throughout the prequel trilogy, it's this that I can only praise him, and that is how he framed the villains. It would have been very easy to have a same and simple story of the good guys being the small underdogs and the bad guys being the big evil government, but that wouldn't have worked for an origin story to the bad evil government. Simply put, it needed to be different, it needed to evolve, and it needed to be a bit more nuanced of a story, and the prequel trilogy's villains, I genuinely think, are better, at least in how the story works around them, than the original trilogy. No one can beat Darth Vader, and no one can beat the Emperor when it comes to being just raw, powerful villains. But the way that the villains took power and the story that surrounds Sidious, and yes, even Dooku, far overpower those of the original trilogy. And that is one thing that I can honestly say the prequel trilogy does better than the original trilogy. The plans for the Clone Wars and the conflict and destruction of the Jedi, not to their full extent, but to a degree, were disclosed to Darth Maul whenever he was apprenticed to Darth Sidious. This plan was in place from the very beginning. And it's clear that the prequels, contextualized by Star Wars The Clone Wars, have an absolutely genius villain dynamic written by George Lucas. But I'm curious to what your thoughts are. Do you prefer the rather, albeit simple but effective, villain dynamic from the original trilogy, or do you prefer the kind of what I consider derivative villain dynamic which we see in the sequel trilogy? Or, like me, do you think that the prequel trilogy really does prove to shine above the other two trilogies in this point? Comment your thoughts below and let me know. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you again next time.